Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for coming back for session 4 of our discussion of the digital age and faith and how we live a good life using the technologies all around us and what our faith has to say about that. So last week we talked about the internet kind of being the backbone of the digital age, the structure that underlies a lot of the different pieces of it. And there was a lot more I wanted to get to talk about the internet. So this time I'm going to talk about more the internet and the impact of the internet that makes on our lives and how we engage it faithfully. There's a lot of things I want to get to today, and again, I think this stuff is fascinating, and I hope that it's interesting for you. I'm a naturally curious person, and so I want to understand how these things impact us and how they work in our lives. So one of the things that researchers are beginning to realize about our interaction with technology, and in particular the internet, but also all the pieces that come out of this, is you can call it different things. You can call it the Google effect. You can call it, you can use the fancy term of cognitive offload. But what the availability of easy information is doing to the way that we store things. So if you're my age, I'm in my mid-40s. I grew up and I had a lot of phone numbers, for example, memorized. I had to know not only the phone number for my home, but my friends and my relatives, and it was constantly reinforced by either on a dialing the number or even using a rotary dial, but having to continually use that information to be able to make a connection. And I just don't remember that many numbers anymore. I know mine, I know my work, I know a few others, but that's really it. And part of that is that there's no longer the need for my memory to store that. Or if you've ever watched the weather forecast and said, so what's the weather going to be like? Well, we know that we can go to the internet or our phones and look that up immediately, but we don't store that a lot of times. It seems like it goes in one ear and out the other. Or if you've ever looked at your watch and said, what time is it, right after you've looked at it, because you just didn't store that information anymore. Well, when information is readily available, our memories begin to say, I don't need to store this, I know where I can get this. And so that's changed all kinds of different things. I mean, I know when I was growing up, when I was doing math, and you're doing multiplication or division or square roots, and why do I have to remember all of this stuff? Why can't I just pull out a calculator and use it? And my teachers would say, well, you won't always have a calculator with you. And if you carry a cell phone, the reality is that you do. But there are lots of pieces of this reality of cognitive offload that we begin to store, or we begin to rely on other places to store information, whether we're storing it digitally somewhere, like we're doing with our contacts, or we are relying on the internet to be able to provide that information on an easy and quick basis, like the weather, or we may have the desire to find out, just kind of a random question. What is the second largest snake in the world? So you could go to Google, for example, and type in what is the second largest snake, and you'll get some lists of the largest snakes in the world. And the reality is, if you, and I know this because I actually went and looked at this particular inquiry, you'll actually get different lists. And it depends on what you mean by largest. Do you mean the longest? Do you mean the heaviest? I mean, those are two different pieces, but the longest snakes are not always the heaviest snakes. That being said, there's a lot to dig into this, because as we continue to take pieces of our memory and, if you're familiar with the Harry Potter series, like Dumbledore would do with his Pensieve, take a piece of memory and place it somewhere else to be stored, there's good and there's bad in this. So one piece in the midst of this discussion is, I'm a person who's curious about curiosity, which may sound strange, but I'm curious about how curiosity is and what makes us work. And what I've been able to kind of learn in the midst of this is most people will say there's two types of curiosity. There is I want to learn more about this, and so I'm going to dig deeper. I'm going to go and research, and I'm going to spend time. I'm going to become I'm going to dedicate time to this craft, to learning about, whether it's playing an instrument or singing or learning a language or becoming a subject matter expert on, a piece of science or a book of the Bible or something that you're passionate about. The going in and digging and finding out information, and that whole process of lovingly committing yourself to try and find out more and to grow in that. That is one type of curiosity. Now, the other type of curiosity is the ooh shiny effect. That which you see and you immediately look at, and it captures your attention, but it doesn't necessarily make you go and delve deeply into it. And so one of the things that the internet is great at is the ooh shiny piece. Oh yeah, here's this cat video, or here's this somebody talking about the internet like you're watching right now, although hopefully I'm encouraging you to dig deeper. There's all kinds of places where we get distracted and where we can have things happen that cause us to look at something and take us away from what we may have been investing our time and energy in somewhere else to dig deeper into something. So if you're constantly surrounded by that which is interesting, but not that which you are willing to invest in, it takes your attention away from that which you're willing to invest in. One of the things that we're seeing now is a lot of countries which don't necessarily have the same level of connection all throughout their schooling system. They are where some of the people who are making some real revolutions in mathematics and science are coming from, because they're having to spend time in the intense development of the skill that goes into that, and they're not near as distracted. There are even people in Silicon Valley who are developing a lot of the technologies are beginning to put limits on how they and their own family use them, because they're beginning to realize that they impact their lives in a negative way, or that they can become a distraction from continuing to grow, continuing to learn, continuing to develop. There is that sense to where, being curious about things and being curious enough to really try to find out about them, that's part of what makes us who we are. And again, if we're continually entertained rather than continually going out and trying to seek, that changes things. So there is also another piece in this that I want to talk about, and that's the reality that a lot of times we need background information to be able to make sense of things. So I'm going to use an example that's not an internet example, it's an example from my son's school, but then I'm going to talk about it in relation to how we find things on the internet. So my son, when he was in high school, was in the STEM, Science, Technology, Engineering, Mathematics program at that high school. And so he comes home one day, and he has, this is his sophomore year of high school, and he comes home and he brings home this problem, and it is a bridge truss. So if you've ever seen a suspension bridge to where you have the metal beams which are up above the bridgeway, that's the type of problem it is, to where you've got this suspension bridge and all these forces that are pulling down on it and trying to figure out, well, what's the force on an individual beam. So I look at this problem, and for those who don't know, my undergraduate was in civil engineering back in the 90s. So that's been a while ago, but I looked at this problem and I realized exactly, this is a statics problem. This is a second year engineering problem, and it takes some background information. So you have to be able to do trigonometry to be able to do statics. You have to be able to have some basic understanding of physics to be able to do statics, and my son has had neither of these. And so, as I said, it was a long time since I'd done any type of problem like this. So I graduated in 1995. This was probably 2016, 2017. So you can do the math on that. It's 20 years. I didn't remember exactly how to do it. I had to go back to an old textbook and reteach myself before I could teach him. And I did leave the teacher a note saying, if I hadn't had this background, if I hadn't had the ability to go back and relearn this, I wouldn't have been able to help him. And that he really didn't have the background to be able to solve this type of problem. But I think sometimes we come at things and we look for that easy answer, and we don't have the background to really understand everything that's going on to solve the type of problem. You'll see, I see this all the time to where, don't confuse your Google search with my doctorate in medicine or my civil engineering degree or, my doctorate in theology, whatever it happens to be. There is something to having that background information, but we sometimes shortcut that. So if anybody's ever, for example, used WebMD, and you put in your symptoms and you come up with a diagnosis and you self-diagnose yourself and you become terrified because here's everything that could be possibly wrong with you. And the reality is you may just have the flu, or you may have just strained a muscle, or whatever it happens to be. There is something to being able to look more comprehensively and have a broader experience with a certain type of information and say, you know what, yeah, that's possible, but here's what makes a lot more sense of this. There's often much more to the conversation than what we get, and I think that also shortcuts us in our right now in our political process. I mean, politics themselves are hard. They're difficult. It is messy. There are compromises, and I think that when you have people who may not be involved in the process, or people who drive one agenda, kind of saying it's all or nothing, we all lose in the midst of that. So again, there is this piece where we sometimes have taken pieces of our memory, we stored them in other places, whether we've relied on technology like the internet to have them available, or just having it at our fingertips, or whether it's just, we've kind of said, hey, here's a place where I'm going to store this online. I do this all the time, to where I write and I store things online so that I can go back and access it later. I think one of the other pieces I want to talk about with this is, if you've ever had the experience to where you're using Netflix or YouTube, and you can go down the list of technologies that do this, Facebook, where you spent hours and hours and hours, and you wonder where that time went. One of the things that a lot of these tech industries have done, and they've learned it from each other, is they've removed what we call stopping clues. So a stopping clue is like in a book, to where you reach the end of a chapter. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to stop, but it's a clue that here's a place where you can put the bookmark in, you can close the book, you can set it aside, and you can go on to what is next. It's a stopping clue. It says, here's a place where you can stop. Here's a logical place to rest. Now, if you're like me when it comes to books, you may say, okay, well, that's great, but I really want to find out what happens next, and so you go on to the next one. And that's a choice that we make. But if you remove the stopping clue, you also remove that clue for people to say, you know what, I can stop here, I can relax, I can turn this off, and I can go do something else, and I can come back to it later. When we used to have week by week episodes of TV, you would reach the end of the show, and you'd have to wait until next week for the next episode to come. But if you're, for example, watching Netflix, it automatically queues up what the next item in the series is, so you can get to the point where, how did I get to season 13, episode 8, and where did the day go? A part of that is they've removed the stopping clues, and it's based on an economic model. So the economic model of most things on the internet is either to, hey, you're subscribing to a service, and if you use the service more, you find it more valuable. So that, in the case of Netflix, they want you to use the service more so that you continue to subscribe to it. And even YouTube has gone to somewhat of this model. But on the other side, there's the economic model to where the more you watch, the more advertisements you see. And so they want to keep you engaged, and so they remove the stopping clue to where here's the next video in this queue, and between videos you're going to see a commercial, and then you're going to go right to the next video, and you're going to see another commercial. And again, it's an economic model that is working for the companies that are using it, but it also is causing people to spend often more time than they intend on a particular function or task, or with a particular object. There are all kinds of things, and I could go a lot of different directions with the internet. One of the things that I do is I try to think about things from a faith perspective. And as I was thinking about the internet from a faith perspective, the the text that came to mind is the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. And, I'm not going to go through it piece by piece by piece, and not every piece necessarily applies to the internet, but I do want to call out a few things. So the Sermon on the Mount begins with the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth, and so on. But right after that comes a discussion of, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light that's put up for the world to see. What does it mean to be salt and light in a digital world? What does it mean to be that which preserves and that which gives illumination? I do try to think about that in my interactions. I think one of the things that is very easy to begin to think about in a digital world, that what we say really doesn't matter in the same way. And that's, I think, where a lot of bullying or trolling on the internet comes from, is that sense that, would you say this to a person's face? Maybe not. There may be more consequences to that. There may be a sense of shame in actually doing that when you were talking to a person, but you feel the freedom or the permission to do that. And I would say that from a faith perspective, we're called to be not only salt and light in the world, but in the digital world as well. That kind of goes into the next piece where it talks about, reinterpreting the commandment on murder. You shall not murder. Well, I say to you, if you are angry with your brother or sister, or if you mutter a curse against them, how we interact with one another online matters, and that there are times where we probably need to apologize to one another. The next piece about this would be in the Sermon on the Mount would be the discussion of adultery, and the reality is there are always going to be probably things out there in the world that we are uncomfortable with, and having a discussion of, and I think if you have a discussion of, for example, pornography, I think you also need to have the discussion about things that are written in, for example, a romance novel that may cause the same type of thoughts. And yet, one of the things I think about this particular piece of the Sermon on the Mount, as Jesus talks about, if you look at a woman with lust in your eyes, you've already committed adultery with her. I believe that one of the pieces of this is when we begin to look at as people as objects, no longer as people but as objects. I think that's a very dangerous place to be, and I think that's a place where we often find ourselves in the internet. We don't think of people as people anymore. We begin to think of them as, these objects that are out there, or these disembodied words and everything else like that. In our political discourse on the internet, among other things, again, the whole reality of trolling, but within our political discourse on the internet, what does it mean when Jesus says, pray for those who curse you, to love your enemies? I'm always kind of disappointed, but I'm also kind of fascinated the way it's so easy to make other people into our enemies until you actually get to know them, until you actually spend time with them. And, we never know why a person thinks the way they do, or what has caused a person to act a certain way, until we invest that time. I think there's some wisdom in the way most other languages other than English talk about the idea of knowing. So in most other languages, there's two words for know. There's knowing as of a fact, and there's knowing as of a person. In English, there's only one. But I think it is worth thinking about, instead of making the easy move, it's a lot easier to hate than it is to love, but instead of making the easy move of saying, this person is against me, they're my enemy, they think differently than me, is to, how do I get to actually know what this person is and what they think? It doesn't mean that you're going to think the same thing, but I invite you to be curious about that. I'm going to jump to the end of the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 7, where it talks about judging others. And I think one of the pieces it's so easy to be about when we talk about digital technology and the way others use it, and just like all kinds of other aspects in our lives, to say, well, they don't do it the way that I think they should do it, and so I'm going to judge them. And the other reality is that, so much of our world is judging other people, shaming other people, and again, it's much harder, but I think it's what we're called to do, is to be engaged in that conversation with one another, to try and understand things from another person's point of view. So that's a little bit of the faith perspective on things. Again, I know some of the things I talked about on the front end are some of the negatives, but I think one of the things the internet can do is it can connect us in ways to do, both our normal things and some things that we've had to do for generation after generation after generation. I think the internet can help us learn how to connect, how to pray, to teach, to even worship. So, for example, both of my kids are in Oklahoma right now, and I live here in Texas. And so every week I'm able to talk with them digitally through Skype, and it's a free service. It is something that, if that wasn't there, and I was, 20 years ago, I'd have to rely on a long distance phone call every week, and again, that added up as far as cost and everything else. But again, here's this technology where I can see my kids' faces, and I can read things that are going on that they may not vocalize in the same way. I will do next week. I've got a conversation with several of my colleagues on the internet through a media called Zoom, where we're having a digital meeting. To where we don't have to drive across the city or across the state to go and be in the same place with one another. I do think that the connection of the internet can help us to be available for people when it comes to things like prayer. I've seen everything from email being used to certain places creating basically a virtual wall of prayer, where a person can come in and, like you would place a note in a wall. Well, if a note is placed on a wall and people can pray about it. If you're watching this right now, you're seeing me kind of lean into how do we teach online. There are limitations and there are gifts. So myself and Adam, who's our youth minister and also kind of our pastoral intern, have very different gifts. I have a lot of information I like to share. I don't mind the lecture format where here's a lot of information. I want to bring discussion into it. I want to see how people are interacting. But that type of conversation is much more suited to the way the technology of the internet is. There are ways you can have and facilitate conversations on the internet. A lot of that's coming out of the video game world with the streaming. But that's also not the way most people are interacting on the internet. Most people are consuming and receiving information, which is, if you're watching this, that's what you're doing now. But there's not necessarily the feedback, the interaction, the one-on-one. So there are certainly gifts. I mean, I'm able to reach a lot larger audience than I would otherwise doing something like this. But I'm not able to be in the same room and to see, for example, how you're responding to the information or to get your feedback on it. The one-on-one kind of back and forth is a lot harder. Are there ways in which you can give feedback? Absolutely. But it's not the same as being in the same place with the person. That being said, it's a great gift. It's a great gift to be able to try to teach or to worship. So I have a colleague of mine who does a live stream of their service, and they've been doing this for a while, and then they had a week where the live stream went down. It just wasn't available. And so they got this church here in Texas, and they got a phone call from Wyoming. And there was a small group of Lutheran Christians in Wyoming that would gather together every week and watch the live stream of their worship, because they didn't have a pastor. They didn't have enough people to be an organized church yet, but they wanted this connection back to this tradition, and they valued that which was going on. It provided a means for them to worship together. Again, there's limitations of it. I mean, there's something to not being in the physical place, but for a person who is homebound, or a person who is separate from a community they feel valued with, for a youth in college who, wants to stay connected to their congregation back home, it is a great gift in that respect. The last thing I want to talk about is, we construct our identity all throughout our lives. What music we listen to, what we study, what we wear, what we wear in different situations, the people we hang out with, the people who we we follow or we want to learn from, the books that we read, all these pieces are constructing who we want to be in different ways. And in the same way we construct our own identity, we also construct a virtual identity. We project ourselves out into the digital world. And I'll talk a lot more about this when we get into social media in a couple weeks, but we do project ourselves out into the world. And does our virtual identity match our physical identity? In a digital world, who do I portray myself as being? And what is the give and take of my virtual identity? So one of the things I know that is being discussed right now is our virtual identity, our digital identity. Is that a fundamental human right? Is that something that we own, or is it something that because we put it out there, the companies have access to, or the governments have access to? And that's a debated topic right now. But there may be things that we can't control about that. But if you get to know me in my congregation, and you were to come to and visit my house, you wouldn't be shocked by the person you met at my house or by the things that I do. I'm pretty open about who I am. It doesn't mean that I share everything about myself. You wouldn't want me to. And certainly if you're only encountering me online, I mean, the pieces that I share about myself, they wouldn't surprise you if you were to meet me in person. And yet, again, we don't share every piece of ourselves. We don't just open up the deepest, darkest pieces of our heart to everybody. That's reserved for people who we actually trust. And yet, I do think in a digital age, it's important that who we are online matches who we are in the rest of our lives. I know when I've interviewed for congregations in the past, I've said, hey, go and take a look at who I am on my social media. Take a look at what I write on my blog. Take a look at how you're going to, again, it's windows I've given you to figure out who I am. And if you look at that and you still say, hey, yeah, we would call you, then I'm maybe your pastor. And again, I think part of it is, and it's not that our identities are going to be these smooth, coherent pieces. They're much more like mosaics, where there are all these different pieces to go together. But if there are all these pieces to where they just don't seem to work, and another reality is that people, when you kind of move from college into the workplace is looking at your digital identity and trying to figure out who you are, and is that a person who we want? So again, these are all things to think about. They're all great gifts. They're all challenges that we have. I mean, the reality is we all use the internet. We all use the internet in all kinds of different ways. And I think we have a choice in how we use it, what we use it for. What is it that we allow from our own memories to be stored there? And what is it that we say, this is important, and I want to make sure that I get curious about this, that I learn more about this, that I store this? And how do I do that? What is it that I trust the internet to give me information on? And what is it that I need to be in conversation with other people about? Who am I when I interact on the internet? Is it a person who holds the values that I have, in my case, as a Christian? And what does my virtual identity look like? So next week we're going to get into cell phones. We're going to talk about the evolution of cell phones and how they impact our lives. So I look forward to having that discussion with you. Thank you for watching, and have a great week.